Ladies and gentlemen, throughout history, there have been places that symbolize the very worst of human cruelty: Auschwitz, Guantanamo Bay, Abu Ghraib, and among them stands a name that still sends shivers down the spine of those who remember: Diyarbakır Prison. Nestled in the heart of southeastern Turkey, this prison is not just a building made of concrete and steel. It is a monument to suffering, a symbol of oppression, and a place where thousands were stripped of their dignity, tortured beyond human limits, and left to rot in silence. For decades, it was known as one of the most brutal prisons in the world, a living nightmare where hope was a distant memory. The story of Diyarbakır Prison is not just about those who were locked inside. It is about the abuse of power, the suppression of identity, and the systematic attempt to crush an entire people. It is about a government that sought to erase voices of dissent through pain and fear. But it is also about resistance, resilience, and the unbreakable human spirit. To understand the horrors of Diyarbakır Prison, we must go back to a time when Turkey was in turmoil, the 1980 military coup. This coup, led by General Kenan Evren, reshaped Turkey with an iron fist. The new regime targeted political opponents, intellectuals, journalists, and most notably, the Kurdish population. Thousands were arrested without fair trials, many for crimes as simple as expressing their thoughts or defending their cultural identity. For these prisoners, Diyarbakır became their personal hell on earth. What they endured behind those walls is beyond comprehension: torture that lasted for hours, forced confessions extracted through unimaginable pain, and psychological warfare designed to strip them of their will to live. But Diyarbakır Prison is more than just a dark chapter of history. It is a lesson, a warning, and a call for justice. It is a reminder that when we turn a blind eye to oppression, prisons become more than places of punishment. They become places of horror. To understand why Diyarbakır Prison became a place of unparalleled suffering, we must look at the political and social chaos that led to its infamy. The prison was originally built in the 1960s, but its true horror began after the military coup of September 12, 1980. This coup, led by General Kenan Evren, marked one of the darkest periods in Turkey's modern history. It was a time of extreme repression, where the state sought absolute control over its people, particularly those who opposed the regime. The coup leaders justified their actions by claiming they wanted to restore stability, but in reality, their rule was defined by brutality, oppression, and the systematic silencing of dissent. In the aftermath of the coup, tens of thousands of people were arrested: intellectuals, journalists, students, activists, and most notably, Kurdish political figures. The government viewed the Kurdish population with suspicion, seeing them as a potential threat to national unity. As a result, many were imprisoned without trial, simply for speaking their language, advocating for their rights, or resisting state oppression. Diyarbakır Prison quickly became one of the most feared detention centers in Turkey. It was transformed from a regular prison into a military-controlled facility, where prisoners were subjected to some of the worst human rights abuses in history. The prison authorities had one goal: to break the prisoners physically, mentally, and emotionally. They wanted to erase their identities, force them into submission, and instill fear in anyone who dared to resist the military regime. For the thousands of people who passed through its gates, Diyarbakır was not just a prison, it was a death sentence in slow motion. The guards were not just enforcers of the law, they were instruments of terror, using extreme violence, psychological warfare, and inhumane conditions to dehumanize those inside. The walls of this prison did not simply hold criminals, they held men and women whose only crime was having a voice. This was a place where law and morality ceased to exist, where the state's iron grip crushed all forms of resistance, and where survival itself became an act of defiance. Once inside Diyarbakır Prison, prisoners quickly realized they had entered a place where human rights, dignity, and morality had no meaning. The prison guards, acting under orders from military authorities, saw the inmates not as human beings, but as enemies of the state, deserving of the most inhumane treatment imaginable. The goal was not just to imprison them, it was to break them completely, physically and mentally. From the moment a prisoner arrived, the torture began. New arrivals were greeted not with questions or legal procedures, but with brutal beatings, electric shocks, and psychological humiliation. Many were forced to strip naked and endure hours of physical abuse, often while being insulted and degraded. Some were forced to crawl like animals or stand in stress positions for hours, sometimes days, until their bodies collapsed from exhaustion. One of the most horrifying aspects of Diyarbakir was the systematic use of electric shocks. Prisoners were often tied to metal chairs or had electrodes attached to their fingers, ears, and genitals. Guards would then turn on the current, sending unbearable waves of pain through their bodies. Those who screamed were beaten harder. Those who resisted were given stronger shocks. Many lost consciousness, only to be revived and tortured again. Sexual violence was another unspeakable horror within Diyarbakir's walls. Both male and female prisoners were subjected to rape and other forms of sexual humiliation as a means of control. Women were often dragged from their cells in the middle of the night, only to return bruised, broken, and silent. The psychological scars of these assaults would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Prisoners were also subjected to extreme psychological torture. Many were forced to memorize and recite Turkish nationalist slogans while being punished for speaking their native Kurdish language. Others were forced to salute pictures of the military leaders who had imprisoned them, or to participate in humiliating rituals designed to strip them of their sense of self. Some were kept in tiny, dark cells for months, deprived of any human contact. Perhaps the most terrifying method of torture was the coffin cells. These were small, box-like enclosures where prisoners were locked up for weeks at a time, unable to sit, stand, or move freely. Many prisoners who survived these cells emerged as broken shadows of their former selves, suffering from permanent physical and psychological damage. Diyarbakir Prison was not just a place of punishment. It was a laboratory of cruelty, where the very limits of human endurance were tested. Every day was a struggle to survive. Every moment was filled with pain and fear. And for many, death was not the worst fate imaginable. It was an escape. Diyarbakir Prison was not just a place for criminals. It became a graveyard for free thought, a dungeon for political dissidents, and a battlefield where ideology was punished with unimaginable cruelty. The overwhelming majority of those imprisoned within its walls were not murderers or thieves but journalists, activists, intellectuals, and most notably, Kurdish political prisoners. Their only crime was demanding justice, advocating for their rights, or simply refusing to bow to the military regime. Following the 1980 military coup, the Turkish government initiated a ruthless crackdown on anyone it saw as a threat to its authority. This included leftist revolutionaries, trade unionists, students, and especially Kurds who dared to speak their language or express their cultural identity. The state viewed Kurdish political activism as separatism, and Diyarbakir became the ultimate tool of suppression. Among the prisoners were members of various political movements, particularly those who opposed the military dictatorship or sought autonomy for the Kurdish people. Many of them had not even committed a crime. They had simply attended a protest, written an article critical of the government, or belonged to an organization that challenged state policies. Some were sentenced to decades in prison based on forced confessions extracted through extreme torture, signed under the unbearable pain of electric shocks, beatings, and sleep deprivation. The Turkish state saw these prisoners as more than just enemies. It saw them as threats that needed to be erased. The military authorities believed that if they could break the political prisoners, especially the Kurdish ones, they could crush the entire movement. Thus, Diyarbakir became a laboratory for psychological and physical warfare, designed to erase Kurdish identity and eliminate opposition through sheer terror. Inside the prison, Kurdish prisoners were subjected to relentless cultural genocide. They were beaten for speaking their mother tongue, forced to recite Turkish nationalist slogans, and made to denounce their heritage. Some were forced to memorize the Turkish national anthem and speeches of military leaders, while being punished for uttering a single word in Kurdish. The goal was clear: erase their identity, strip them of their beliefs, and turn them into hollow shells. But despite the unbearable oppression, resistance never died. Many of these political prisoners refused to surrender their beliefs. They smuggled letters to the outside world, documenting their suffering. They whispered their stories in dark cells, ensuring that their voices would not be silenced forever. Some organized secret hunger strikes, choosing starvation over submission. Even in the depths of hell, they refused to let their spirits be broken. Diyarbakır Prison was meant to silence a generation of political thinkers and Kurdish activists, but instead, it became a symbol of resistance. The sacrifices made within those walls would later fuel greater struggles for justice, proving that even in the face of the worst oppression, the human spirit can endure. I end Diyarbakır Prison, where torture and humiliation were daily realities. Resistance was both dangerous and inevitable. Despite enduring unimaginable suffering, the prisoners, especially the Kurdish political detainees, refused to surrender their beliefs. With no weapons, no outside help, and no chance of a fair trial, they turned their very bodies into battlegrounds. Hunger strikes, self-immolations, and secret acts of defiance became their most powerful tools against an oppressive regime determined to break them. One of the most notorious hunger strikes in Diyarbakır's history began in 1982. By this time, the brutality inside the prison had reached its peak. The prisoners had suffered years of extreme torture, electrocutions, beatings, sexual violence, and psychological torment. The prison authorities aimed not just to punish them but to erase their identity and humanity. Speaking Kurdish was banned, political prisoners were forced to salute portraits of military leaders, and anyone who resisted was beaten to the brink of death. Realizing that traditional protests would only lead to more brutal retaliation, the prisoners resorted to a desperate yet powerful form of resistance: hunger strikes. Denying themselves food was the only weapon they had left. It was a message to the world, a statement that they would rather die on their own terms than live as broken souls under the boot of their oppressors. The hunger strike quickly gained momentum. Dozens of prisoners joined, their bodies growing weaker each day. Their demands were simple: an end to torture, the right to speak their own language, and humane treatment. But the prison authorities refused to listen. Instead, they responded with even greater cruelty. Some hunger strikers were forcibly fed through tubes, a brutal and painful process that often led to internal injuries. Others were dragged from their cells and beaten to near death in an attempt to force them to eat. As the days turned into weeks, the situation became dire. Several prisoners died from starvation, their bodies reduced to mere skeletons, but their spirits unbroken. Their deaths sent shockwaves through the prison, inspiring others to continue the fight. The hunger strikes soon escalated into self-immolation, with some prisoners setting themselves on fire in a final act of defiance. Their flames were a horrifying yet powerful symbol of resistance, forcing the world to pay attention to the horrors unfolding within Diyarbakır's walls. These acts of defiance were not in vain. News of the hunger strikes and suicides leaked beyond the prison walls, reaching international human rights organizations. The sheer brutality of the Diyarbakır authorities became impossible to ignore. While the Turkish government refused to acknowledge its crimes, the outside world began to recognize the resilience and suffering of the prisoners. Even inside the prison, these protests became a source of unity and strength. Despite the torture, despite the starvation, the prisoners stood together, showing their captors that their spirits could not be broken. Their bodies may have been weak, but their will remained unshaken. For years, Diyarbakır Prison operated in the shadows, its horrors known only to those trapped inside and the few families who dared to seek answers. The Turkish military regime, controlling the media with an iron grip, ensured that stories of torture, forced confessions, and brutal executions remained buried. But as the scale of the abuse grew and survivors managed to smuggle out their harrowing testimonies, the world began to take notice. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, reports of widespread torture and human rights abuses in Turkey started surfacing in international media. Human rights organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch began investigating the accounts of former prisoners, revealing a pattern of systemic brutality. These reports painted a grim picture. Prisoners were not only being beaten and electrocuted, but were also subjected to prolonged solitary confinement, sexual violence, and psychological warfare designed to strip them of their will to live. One of the most shocking revelations came from the survivors of the 1982 hunger strikes, whose testimonies reached the international press. They described how prisoners were forced to eat their own vomit, how guards urinated on them as punishment, and how those who resisted were subjected to coffin cells, where they could neither stand nor sit comfortably for weeks at a time. The international community, which had largely ignored the suffering inside Diyarbakir, could no longer look away. Western governments, particularly those in Europe and the United States, began pressuring Turkey to reform its prison system and improve its human rights record. The European Parliament and the United Nations raised concerns over the treatment of prisoners, demanding that Turkey allow independent observers to inspect its detention facilities. Turkey, seeking to improve its image on the world stage and maintain its aspirations for European Union membership, denied many of the allegations but reluctantly agreed to limited reforms. However, these reforms were mostly superficial, with the worst abuses continuing in secret. International observers were either blocked from accessing the most notorious prisons or were shown sanitized versions of reality. Meanwhile, Kurdish and Turkish human rights activists living in exile worked tirelessly to expose the truth. They organized protests in European capitals, published memoirs of survivors, and lobbied foreign governments to take stronger action against Turkey's repressive policies. Diyarbakir Prison had become a symbol of Turkey's broader crackdown on political dissent, and the world was finally beginning to see the true extent of the regime's cruelty. Despite growing international condemnation, justice remained elusive. The Turkish government refused to hold the perpetrators accountable, and many of the prison officials responsible for the abuse were never punished. Some even rose to higher ranks within the security forces, their crimes swept under the rug by a system that had little interest in confronting its dark past. Even so, the international exposure of Diyarbakir Prison's horrors played a crucial role in shaping the global perception of human rights in Turkey. It placed pressure on the government, emboldened activists, and ensured that the voices of the victims would not be completely silenced. The prison, once a hidden torture chamber, had been dragged into the light of global scrutiny, a stain on Turkey's history that could no longer be ignored. The true horrors of Diyarbakir Prison were not fully understood until the voices of survivors began to emerge. These were not just stories of suffering but of endurance, defiance, and the unbreakable human spirit. The testimonies of those who lived through Diyarbakir's brutality revealed a world where torture was a daily ritual, death was a constant companion, and survival itself was an act of rebellion. Many of the survivors were young political activists, intellectuals, journalists, and students arrested after the 1980 military coup. Some were detained for merely possessing a banned book, speaking Kurdish, or having ties to leftist organizations. Others had done nothing at all but were swept up in the mass arrests that followed the military takeover. Once inside, they were stripped of their identities and subjected to a nightmarish system designed to break their bodies and minds. One former prisoner recounted how guards would force inmates to crawl like animals while being beaten with iron rods. He described the feeling of losing all sense of time, locked in complete darkness for weeks, with only the screams of other prisoners to remind him he was not alone. Others told of forced confessions extracted through unbearable torture, where prisoners were beaten unconscious, revived with buckets of water, and beaten again until they signed false statements. One of the most harrowing testimonies came from a man who had been subjected to the notorious coffin cells, tiny, enclosed boxes where prisoners were forced to stay for weeks, unable to move. He described the sensation of losing control over his body, his muscles atrophying, and his mind slipping into hallucinations as he desperately tried to hold onto his sanity. Another survivor, a Kurdish woman, recalled the brutality inflicted upon female prisoners. She spoke of sexual violence, constant surveillance, and forced strip searches designed to humiliate and degrade. Women who resisted were subjected to even harsher beatings, and many emerged from Diyarbakir forever scarred, not just physically, but emotionally and psychologically. The psychological torture was just as devastating as the physical abuse. Many prisoners were forced to betray their own beliefs, reciting nationalist slogans while being electrocuted, or denouncing their fellow inmates under extreme duress. Some broke under the pressure, but others found ways to resist in silence, secretly whispering Kurdish poetry or tapping messages of hope to one another through the prison walls. Even after their release, survivors found themselves permanently marked by their experiences. Many suffered from severe PTSD, nightmares, and physical ailments caused by years of torture. Some never spoke of what they endured, fearing retribution from the state. Others, however, became outspoken activists, dedicating their lives to exposing the truth about Diyarbakir and seeking justice for those who did not survive. The stories of these survivors serve as a chilling reminder of the depths of human cruelty, but also of the extraordinary resilience of those who refuse to be broken. They carry their scars with them, not just as wounds from the past, but as evidence of a brutal system that must never be forgotten. The physical pain endured by the prisoners of Diyarbakir was horrific, but for many, the psychological wounds were even more devastating. Long after their bruises faded and their bones healed, the mental scars remained, a haunting reminder of the unimaginable suffering they endured. For many survivors, release from Diyarbakir prison did not mean freedom. They carried their trauma with them, trapped in a prison of the mind that no walls could contain. The torture methods used in Diyarbakir were not just designed to break the body, but to shatter the soul. Prisoners were subjected to prolonged psychological torment, aimed at stripping them of their identity, hope, and will to live. Some were locked away in complete isolation for weeks or even months, with no light, no human contact, and no sense of time. Others were forced to witness the torture of their fellow inmates, knowing they were powerless to stop it. Many were coerced into betraying their friends, signing false confessions under duress, only to be tormented by guilt for the rest of their lives. One of the most insidious tactics used by the prison guards was forced indoctrination. Kurdish prisoners were made to recite Turkish nationalist slogans daily, swear loyalty to the regime, and even denounce their own language and heritage. If they hesitated or refused, they were beaten or subjected to sleep deprivation until they complied. The psychological toll of this forced assimilation was immense. Many prisoners emerged from Diyarbakir struggling with their sense of identity, feeling as though their very existence had been erased. Many former prisoners suffered from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, haunted by nightmares of the torture they endured. Even years after their release, the sound of a slamming door, a sudden loud noise, or the sight of a uniformed officer could trigger a wave of terror, transporting them back to their days inside Diyarbakir's brutal walls. Some survivors lost the ability to trust others, fearing that at any moment they could be betrayed or imprisoned again. Depression and suicidal thoughts were tragically common among those who had endured Diyarbakir's horrors. Many former inmates struggled with feelings of guilt and shame, believing that they had failed their fellow prisoners or that they had been irreparably broken by their experience. Some survivors, unable to escape the memories, took their own lives, choosing death over a life filled with pain and unrelenting trauma. Even those who tried to rebuild their lives outside of prison faced constant surveillance and harassment from the Turkish authorities. Many former prisoners were treated as outcasts, struggling to find work or reintegrate into society. Their past as political prisoners followed them like a shadow, preventing them from ever truly escaping the grip of Diyarbakir. Some were rearrested, their suffering renewed, while others were forced into exile, separated from their homeland and loved ones. For the families of those imprisoned, the psychological impact was just as profound. Mothers, fathers, spouses, and children were left in a state of endless anxiety, uncertain whether their loved ones were dead or alive. Some families went years without any contact, and when they finally saw their loved ones again, they found hollowed-out shells of the people they once knew, forever changed by the brutality they had endured. Diyarbakir prison was not just a place of physical suffering, it was a psychological abyss, designed to break prisoners from the inside out. Even those who survived and walked free would never truly escape it. Their bodies left Diyarbakir, but their minds remained trapped in its darkness. Diyarbakir prison was more than just a place of suffering. It became a symbol of the Kurdish struggle for identity, dignity, and freedom. For decades, the Kurdish people had faced systemic oppression in Turkey, their language banned, their culture suppressed, and their political movements crushed under the weight of authoritarian rule. But after the 1980 military coup, this repression reached a terrifying new level, with Diyarbakir serving as the epicenter of the state's brutal campaign against Kurdish resistance. The Turkish government viewed Kurdish political movements as a direct threat to national unity. Any expression of Kurdish identity was seen as separatism, and those who spoke out, whether as activists, journalists, or ordinary citizens, were labeled as terrorists and enemies of the state. Diyarbakir prison became the regime's strongest weapon in its attempt to silence Kurdish voices. Many of those imprisoned in Diyarbakir were young Kurdish men and women who had committed no crime other than seeking basic rights, such as the right to speak their own language, practice their own customs, and participate in politics, without fear of persecution. Some were arrested simply for possessing Kurdish literature, attending protests, or being suspected of supporting Kurdish political organizations. Others were detained without any real cause at all, swept up in mass arrests as the state attempted to instill fear in the Kurdish population. Once inside the prison, these Kurdish prisoners were subjected to brutal cultural erasure. Speaking Kurdish was forbidden, and those caught using their mother tongue were met with savage beatings. Prisoners were forced to sing Turkish nationalist songs, swear loyalty to the state, and even denounce their own heritage. Some were made to trample on Kurdish flags and symbols, while others were coerced into signing confessions denouncing their political beliefs. But despite this extreme repression, the Kurdish prisoners never stopped resisting. Their defiance took many forms: whispering in Kurdish when the guards weren't listening, secretly writing letters to the outside world, and organizing hunger strikes to protest the inhumane conditions. Even in the depths of their suffering, they refused to let their Kurdish identity be erased. The infamous 1982 hunger strikes were among the most powerful acts of Kurdish resistance. Prisoners risked their lives by refusing food, demanding an end to torture, and the right to be treated with dignity. As their bodies wasted away, their spirits remained unbroken. Some embraced death as a final act of defiance, choosing to perish rather than submit to their oppressors. These hunger strikers became martyrs in the Kurdish struggle, their names etched into history as symbols of unwavering resistance. News of the atrocities inside Diyarbakir spread beyond Turkey's borders, sparking global awareness of the Kurdish plight. The testimonies of survivors painted a horrifying picture of systematic oppression, fueling international debates about Turkey's treatment of the Kurdish population. The suffering endured inside Diyarbakir fueled a growing Kurdish nationalist movement, strengthening the resolve of those fighting for autonomy, cultural preservation, and basic human rights. The horrors of Diyarbakir did not crush the Kurdish people. They ignited a deeper sense of unity and resistance. The prison, once a symbol of terror, became a rallying point for a movement that refused to be silenced. The blood, pain, and sacrifice of those who suffered behind its walls would serve as a painful but powerful reminder that the fight for Kurdish rights was far from over. Despite the unimaginable horrors that unfolded within Diyarbakir prison, justice has remained elusive. The prison, infamous for its systematic torture, human rights violations, and psychological destruction of thousands, should have been the subject of major war crime trials. The guards, commanders, and officials who orchestrated this reign of terror should have faced accountability. But instead, the vast majority of them walked free, their crimes never truly punished, their victims left to suffer in silence. For decades, the Turkish state has actively worked to suppress the truth about Diyarbakir. Even as survivors began to share their testimonies and human rights organizations documented the abuses, there was no official acknowledgement from the government. The regime that oversaw the prison's worst years protected its own, refusing to investigate or prosecute the officials responsible for the mass torture and deaths of prisoners. Many of the prison guards and officers who inflicted unspeakable cruelty on the detainees were not only shielded from prosecution but were often rewarded with promotions. Some moved on to higher positions within the Turkish security forces, continuing their careers without consequence. Others retired with honors, their brutal pasts erased from official records. The architects of Diyarbakir's terror continued to live their lives freely, while their victims carried the weight of trauma, scars, and broken families. Even when Turkey began making legal reforms in the 2000s, Diyarbakır Prison remained a subject of silence. Political discussions about the prison were discouraged, and efforts to open investigations were blocked. When victims and activists demanded justice, they were often met with threats, censorship, or outright dismissal. The government refused to hold trials, fearing that acknowledging these crimes would expose the full scale of state-sponsored brutality. In rare cases where former prisoners filed lawsuits against their torturers, the legal system worked against them. Many cases were thrown out due to lack of evidence, even when survivors provided detailed testimonies and medical reports of their injuries. Others were dismissed under the argument that the events had taken place too long ago to be prosecuted. This deliberate delay and obstruction of justice ensured that many of the worst offenders would never face the consequences of their actions. For the families of those who died within the walls of Diyarbakır, the denial of justice has been an open wound. They never received answers, apologies, or recognition for the suffering of their loved ones. The Turkish government has never officially acknowledged the number of people tortured, killed, or permanently disabled due to their time in Diyarbakır. The prison became a ghost of the past, a wound that the state refused to treat, hoping time would erase its memory. However, despite the government's refusal to hold the perpetrators accountable, the demand for justice has never died. Survivors, activists, and human rights organizations have continued to fight for recognition, accountability, and legal action. They have compiled testimonies, documented evidence, and kept the stories of Diyarbakır alive. Even if the Turkish legal system refuses to prosecute the prison's former commanders, the historical record has been written. The truth cannot be erased. Yet, the fact remains, Diyarbakır Prison stands as one of the greatest unpunished crimes in modern Turkish history. The men who ordered the torture, the guards who carried out the beatings, and the officials who turned a blind eye have escaped justice. The victims, on the other hand, continue to live with their trauma, waiting for the day when the world will finally hold their oppressors accountable. Even though the cells of Diyarbakır Prison no longer echo with the screams of the tortured, its dark legacy continues to haunt Turkey and, in particular, the Kurdish people. The horrors that unfolded behind its walls did not simply vanish when the doors were unlocked. The suffering endured by the prisoners left deep, unhealed wounds that have affected generations. The psychological, social, and political consequences of Diyarbakır's brutality still linger, shaping the lives of survivors, their families, and the broader Kurdish struggle for justice and recognition. For the survivors, freedom did not bring peace. Many former prisoners, even decades after their release, still suffer from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, depression, and anxiety. The nightmares of their time in Diyarbakır continue to haunt them, and even ordinary sounds, footsteps, metal doors clanging, or sudden shouts, can send them spiraling back into their memories of captivity. Some live in constant fear, unable to trust even their own shadows, while others struggle to reconnect with their families and communities after years of isolation and torture. The families of those who suffered in Diyarbakır have also carried the burden of this dark past. Many parents, spouses, and children spent years searching for their loved ones, desperate for news, only to be met with silence or outright lies from authorities. Some never saw their loved ones again, their only knowledge of their fate coming from whispers of other prisoners who managed to escape. For those who did reunite, they found not the same person who had been taken away, but a broken version, haunted, distant, and forever changed. Entire Kurdish communities were affected by Diyarbakır Prison's brutality. The fear of arbitrary arrests, torture, and state violence spread beyond the prison walls, silencing voices and discouraging activism for years. Parents warned their children never to speak about politics, never to question the government, never to stand out, because they knew that even the slightest suspicion could lead to a fate worse than death. This climate of fear, deeply ingrained, prevented many from seeking justice or speaking openly about the horrors they had endured. Yet, despite this silence, Diyarbakır Prison became a powerful symbol of resistance. The stories of those who suffered within its walls fueled a stronger Kurdish identity, uniting people in their fight for recognition and justice. Survivors became activists, authors, and educators, ensuring that the memory of Diyarbakir would not be erased from history. The prison, once a place meant to break the Kurdish spirit, ironically became a cornerstone of Kurdish resilience and the struggle for human rights. However, the Turkish state has largely avoided addressing the full impact of Diyarbakir prison. While some prison reforms have taken place and human rights discussions have entered public discourse, there has never been a full reckoning with the crimes committed within its walls. Many Kurdish families are still waiting for official acknowledgement, reparations, and an apology, none of which have ever been given. Moreover, the patterns of state repression that fueled the horrors of Diyarbakir prison have not completely disappeared. While Turkey has modernized its prison system, reports of torture, arbitrary detentions, and political suppression persist, especially against journalists, activists, and members of the Kurdish community. The ghosts of Diyarbakir have not faded, they have simply taken new forms. The legacy of Diyarbakir is not just one of suffering, but of unfinished justice. The survivors still wait for accountability. The families of the dead still search for closure. And the Kurdish people still fight against a system that, decades later, continues to marginalize them. Until the full truth of Diyarbakir is acknowledged, until the victims receive justice, and until history is confronted without denial, the wounds inflicted by Diyarbakir prison will never truly heal. Decades after the peak of its brutality, Diyarbakir prison remains an open wound in Turkey's history, a symbol of state oppression, human rights violations, and the ongoing struggle for justice. For the survivors, their families, and countless human rights advocates, the fight to acknowledge what happened within its walls is far from over. The demand for accountability, recognition, and reparations has not faded. If anything, it has only grown stronger with time. For years, activists, historians, and former prisoners have fought to bring Diyarbakir's horrors into the public consciousness. They have compiled testimonies, documented evidence, and campaigned tirelessly to ensure that those responsible for the torture, abuse, and deaths of inmates are held accountable. Survivors have come forward, risking their safety to share their stories, ensuring that the crimes committed inside Diyarbakir are not forgotten. These testimonies serve as a living record of the pain and suffering inflicted within the prison's walls, evidence that cannot be erased, no matter how much the state tries to suppress it. Despite these efforts, justice remains elusive. The Turkish government has never issued an official apology, never conducted a full investigation, and never held trials for those responsible. Even in modern Turkey, where discussions of human rights have gained more attention, Diyarbakir remains a deeply uncomfortable topic, one that many officials prefer to ignore rather than confront. Attempts to open legal cases against former prison guards and officials have been met with resistance, delays, and dismissals under various legal loopholes, ensuring that the worst perpetrators remain free. International human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, have repeatedly called for an independent investigation into Diyarbakir prison and its legacy. They have urged Turkey to acknowledge its past crimes, provide justice for victims, and ensure that such atrocities are never repeated. However, these calls have often been dismissed by Turkish authorities as politically motivated attacks against the state. Beyond legal justice, activists have also fought to turn Diyarbakir prison into a memorial site, a place where future generations can learn about the atrocities committed there and honor the memory of those who suffered. Many argue that preserving Diyarbakir as a historical site, much like other locations of past human rights violations around the world, would serve as a powerful reminder of the consequences of state brutality and the importance of safeguarding human rights. Yet, efforts to memorialize Diyarbakir have been met with opposition. The Turkish state has instead sought to erase its dark past, whitewashing history, and avoiding discussions about the prison's role in systematic repression. In 2022, the government announced plans to demolish sections of the prison and repurpose the land, framing it as a step toward healing the city. While some welcomed this move, many survivors and activists saw it as an attempt to bury the truth along with the prison itself. For the Kurdish community, Diyarbakir prison remains a lasting symbol of their struggle, a reminder that their fight for justice, recognition, and equal rights is far from over. Every time the government refuses to acknowledge what happened, every time it suppresses discussion of Diyarbakir's history, it deepens the pain of those who suffered. The road to justice is long and difficult. But as long as the survivors speak, as long as the families of the victims continue to demand answers, and as long as activists refuse to let the memory of Diyarbakir fade into silence, the fight for truth will continue. The calls for recognition and accountability may be ignored by those in power, but they will not be forgotten by history. Diyarbakir Prison stands as one of the darkest chapters in Turkey's modern history, a place where torture, psychological torment, and cultural erasure were used as weapons against those who dared to resist. The brutality that unfolded within its walls was not just the work of sadistic prison guards, nor was it simply an unfortunate consequence of military rule. It was a deliberate, systematic campaign designed to silence dissent, crush Kurdish identity, and instill fear into an entire population. Yet, despite the horrors endured by thousands, Diyarbakir's legacy is not just one of suffering, it is also one of resistance. The prisoners who endured unimaginable torture and yet refused to betray their identities, the families who fought tirelessly for answers about their missing loved ones, and the activists who have kept the memory of Diyarbakir alive all stand as testaments to the unbreakable spirit of those who suffered. But the wounds inflicted by Diyarbakir Prison have never truly healed. Justice has been denied, accountability has been avoided, and the victims have been left without closure. The state has refused to recognize the crimes committed, prosecute those responsible, or even acknowledge the full extent of what happened. Attempts to erase Diyarbakir's dark past through silence, destruction, or historical revisionism cannot change the truth. The pain of Diyarbakir still lingers, and until justice is served, it will continue to haunt Turkey's conscience. The fight for justice is not just about punishing those responsible, it is about ensuring that such atrocities never happen again. It is about recognizing the suffering of the victims, honoring their courage, and creating a society where no one has to fear being imprisoned, tortured, or killed simply for their beliefs, identity, or political views. Without justice, there can be no true reconciliation. Without acknowledgement, there can be no healing. Diyarbakir Prison should not be allowed to fade into forgotten history. It must serve as a warning, a lesson, and a call to action. The survivors, the families of the victims, and the Kurdish people continue to demand the truth, and their voices must not be silenced. The question remains, will Turkey confront its past and deliver justice, or will Diyarbakir remain a symbol of unpunished cruelty? History is watching. The world is watching. And as long as the memory of Diyarbakir lives on, the demand for justice will never die.